Chapter 1. The House Before the Storm. I used to think the worst pain a mother could feel was losing her child. I was wrong. The real pain is watching the person you raised become a stranger's shadow. The night my daughter-in-law called me filthy in my own kitchen, I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I simply looked at her and saw what I'd been too blind to see for years, the quiet war she had been waging under my roof. Every smile, every polite word had been part of a plan to erase me. But what she didn't know was that I had already stopped being afraid. The house she tried to steal, the name she tried to erase, the truth she buried, it would all rise again, and when it did, no lie could stand against it. But before the truth rose, there was the silence, the kind that changes everything. I was 66 when I realized that the house I had loved for more than 3 decades no longer felt like mine. Richard and I had built our lives here in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of Boulder, Colorado. The walls had seen birthday candles, Christmas mornings, arguments that faded with time, and the laughter of a family that once felt unshakable. It was supposed to be our forever home, a place where we would grow old in peace. When our only son Luke called in the spring of 2015 to say that he and his wife had both lost their jobs, I didn't hesitate. They had just married 2 years earlier, and they were struggling with rent in Denver. Richard and I agreed without much discussion. Of course they could move in. Family helps family. That was what I said to him that night while I folded laundry. Richard nodded and smiled. We thought it would be for a few months, maybe a year at most. Vanessa arrived with her polished smile and a kind of energy that filled every room. She thanked us for being so generous, promised it would be temporary, and said she wanted to contribute as much as she could. I believed her. She seemed bright, ambitious, and determined to make things work. I even admired her at first. She reorganized the kitchen pantry and labeled everything neatly. She offered to cook dinner, insisting that we relax. When she served quinoa salad and grilled chicken, I told her it was delicious, even though I missed the heavier meals Richard and I were used to. But months became years, and slowly, almost invisibly, small boundaries began to disappear. The first change came with the kitchen. One evening I was making stew, and Vanessa stepped in and said, "You don't have to cook anymore, Emma. I know you get tired. Let me handle meals." Her tone was polite, but something in it made me step aside. I told myself she meant well. Then came the living room furniture, moved around one weekend while we were visiting Richard's sister. "It flows better this way," she said. I didn't argue, even though the old setup had felt like home. By 2020, it was clear the arrangement was no longer temporary. Luke had found a modest marketing job, but insisted that living with us allowed them to save for a down payment. Vanessa left her paralegal position when she became pregnant, saying she wanted to focus on creating a healthy environment. I tried to be understanding. I remembered how hard it was to be a new mother. Still, it stung when she began referring to the house as our home. Richard rarely noticed the tension. He was 70 then, content with his gardening and crossword puzzles. He thought I worried too much. "She's just trying to help," he would say, not looking up from his paper. Maybe he didn't hear the way Vanessa's tone sharpened when she gave me instructions about cleaning, or how she criticized my choice of detergent because the baby shouldn't be exposed to so many chemicals. The day they brought Oliver home from the hospital was one of those Colorado spring mornings that pretends to be warm, but still carries a bite of winter. I had spent the entire week preparing washing tiny clothes and setting up a crib in the guest room. I wanted to give them space, but also help when they needed it. When they arrived, I saw the exhaustion on Luke's face and the tightness in Vanessa's smile. She held the baby close, wrapped in a soft blue blanket, and allowed me only a quick glance. That first night, I barely slept. Every small sound from the hallway made me sit up. I wanted to make sure they were all right. The next morning, I brewed coffee and arranged flowers in a vase, something cheerful to welcome the baby home. I could hear Vanessa moving around in the living room, her voice low and sharp, as she talked to Luke about feeding schedules. When the baby started crying, I walked in holding the vase of flowers. The sunlight was spilling through the blinds and I could see dust dancing in the air. Vanessa looked exhausted, her hair pulled back, dark circles under her eyes. I said softly, "Can I hold him while you rest for a bit?" She hesitated, then nodded without speaking. I washed my hands carefully, took a clean towel, and reached for the baby. The moment he was in my arms, something deep inside me stirred. His skin was warm against the towel, and he stopped crying as if he knew he was safe. I whispered a small lullaby, one I used to sing to Luke when he was an infant. Richard watched from the doorway, smiling gently. "He likes you," he said. Then Vanessa's voice cut through the quiet. "What are you doing?" She was standing behind me, her eyes wide, her voice trembling with fury. I turned startled. "I'm just holding him," I said. "You should get some rest." In 2 steps, she was beside me. She yanked the baby from my arms so abruptly that his little hat fell to the floor. "Don't touch him!" she shouted. "You're filthy. I don't want your hands on him." The words hit like a slap. I stood frozen, my arms still half raised. Richard stepped forward, his face pale. "Vanessa," he began. She washed her hands. "That's uncalled for." Luke was behind her, speechless. He looked from his wife to me and then at the floor. Say something, I wanted to plead, but no sound came out. The baby began to cry again, louder this time. Vanessa turned away from me, whispering to him in a soothing tone as if I were the danger. The silence that followed was unbearable. Richard moved toward me, but I lifted a hand. "It's fine," I said quietly. My voice didn't sound like my own. My cheeks burned, but my eyes stayed dry. I picked up the little hat from the floor, smoothed it between my fingers, and placed it on the table. Vanessa didn't look back as she walked to the nursery. Luke mumbled something about stress and lack of sleep. I nodded, unable to speak. Richard put a hand on my shoulder, but I stepped away gently. "I'm going upstairs," I said. In our room, the air felt heavy. The afternoon light painted long stripes across the floorboards. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the window where the curtains swayed lightly in the breeze. I could hear faint voices downstairs, the creak of the rocking chair, the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of life continuing as if nothing had happened. For years, I had convinced myself that keeping peace was the same as keeping family. I had thought silence was strength. But at that moment, looking around the room that felt both familiar and foreign, I knew something had shifted. I walked to the window and looked out at the yard Richard had tended for decades. The rose bushes were blooming early, the petals trembling in the wind. I pressed my hand against the glass and whispered to myself, almost afraid to hear the words. I have let someone steal my peace right inside my own home. Downstairs, the baby's cries softened, replaced by Vanessa's low murmur. I stood there for a long time, wondering when this house had stopped feeling like mine, and when exactly I had become a guest in my own life. Chapter 2. Years of Silent Erasure. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, though I had hardly slept. Richard was still breathing softly beside me, unaware of the ache that had settled in my chest. I slipped from bed and went downstairs, the floorboards creaking in the same familiar rhythm, but it felt like walking through someone else's house. The scent of lavender cleaner lingered in the air. Vanessa must have mopped after I went to bed. Even the smell of my own home was no longer mine. I brewed coffee quietly, careful not to wake anyone. The house felt too still, like it was holding its breath. I sat at the kitchen table with my hands wrapped around the mug, staring at the vase of flowers I had arranged the day before. They were already gone, replaced by a new bouquet, perfectly trimmed, tied with a white ribbon. When Vanessa came down later, she looked rested, her hair brushed, her voice calm. She smiled, that careful smile that never reached her eyes, and said, "Morning, Emma. I moved your vase upstairs. I thought it would be nice for your room." I nodded and said nothing. There were no arguments left in me that day. Weeks passed and life adjusted itself into a new rhythm. Vanessa's rhythm. Meals were planned according to her diet books. Groceries had to come from organic markets, even though they cost twice as much. She told Richard that salt wasn't healthy for someone his age, and she told me sugar was poisonous. She started handling the grocery list, saying it would save me time. I let her. She began rearranging the house, moving small things first. Family photos that used to sit above the fireplace were replaced with new frames that matched her minimalist taste. The heavy curtains I loved were taken down one afternoon while I was at a doctor's appointment. When I came home, the sunlight was streaming too bright into the room. She said it made the house feel more modern. Then came the bedrooms. One evening, she approached me while I was folding laundry. "Emma, I think it would make sense for you and Richard to move upstairs," she said in that polite tone that always felt like a command. "You'll have more privacy, and the main floor will be easier for me and the baby." I looked at her, my hands still holding a towel. "You want our bedroom?" "It's not like that," she said quickly, smiling. "It's just that I'll be up at night feeding the baby and I don't want to disturb you." Richard, who had been reading in the living room, said, "That sounds reasonable." So we moved upstairs. The room was smaller, the ceiling lower, and the window looked out onto the roof instead of the yard. The first night there, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking how easily we had been displaced. By 2021, the house was entirely under Vanessa's command. Every decision went through her. Luke hardly noticed. He was busy with work, grateful for the free rent, eager to keep the peace. When I tried to talk to him about how things had changed, he only said, "Mom, please don't make it harder. Vanessa just likes things organized. Richard told me to let it go." "She means well," he said, turning the page of his newspaper. "You're taking it too personally." I stopped arguing, but I began to notice things. Bills that used to arrive in the mail were no longer coming. I asked Richard if he had paid the property tax, and he said he hadn't seen the notice yet. When I checked the mailbox, there were only envelopes addressed to the Parker household. My name wasn't on them anymore. One afternoon, I sat down at the old desk in the corner of the living room to go through the finances. I opened our online account for the utility company. The login didn't work. I tried again and the password had been changed. I clicked on the forgotten password option and saw the recovery email listed as VH Parker, Gmail. A chill spread through me. I went to the water company's website and found the same thing. Then the insurance account. Every one of them had been switched, all in her name. When Richard came in from the garden, I asked him, trying to keep my voice steady, "Did you let Vanessa handle the bills?" He wiped his hands on his jeans and nodded. "She said she could set up automatic payments. Makes sense, right? Less to worry about." I wanted to scream, but I just said, "I suppose." He smiled and went upstairs to shower, humming softly, completely unaware of what I had seen. That night, I couldn't eat. The air felt heavy pressing against me. I told myself I might be overreacting, that maybe she was just trying to help. But something deep inside whispered otherwise. The next day, while everyone was out, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. I logged into the bank. The screen took longer than usual to load. When it did, I saw a new linked account under our household profile. It was named Hart Parker Household Account. It used our home address. I scrolled through the details, my pulse quickening. The account had been active for months. Payments for the utilities, property tax, even groceries were being funneled through it. The name Emma Parker appeared nowhere. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen. I could hear the ticking of the wall clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator. Outside, children were laughing somewhere down the street. The world went on as if nothing had changed while mine quietly shifted beneath me. When I heard the sound of the garage door opening, I closed the laptop quickly. Vanessa's voice floated in cheerful calling for Luke to help with the baby seat. I sat perfectly still, pretending to read a magazine. She walked past me with a smile that felt like a knife. "Everything okay, Emma?" she asked lightly. "Just fine," I said. She glanced at the table at the laptop, and for a second something flickered in her eyes. Then she turned away. That night I lay awake beside Richard, listening to the soft creak of the ceiling fan. I wanted to tell him everything, but I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to be sure. Over the next week, I started saving every document I could find. I printed statements, copied receipts, took photos of envelopes that arrived addressed to her. I stored them in a folder labeled simply House. It became a secret ritual. Every morning when Richard went to tend the garden, I opened my folder, double-checked the dates, and made notes in the margins. Each line of print felt like another thread pulled from the life I thought I had. One afternoon, while sorting through the documents, I stopped to rest my eyes. The house was quiet except for the faint whir of the ceiling fan. I thought about the day Luke was born, how small he had been in my arms, how I had promised to protect him. I had never imagined that the danger would come from the woman he loved. The sun was setting, streaking the walls with orange light. I turned on the desk lamp, reopened the bank app on my phone, and looked again at that name. Hart Parker Household Account. The words glowed on the screen, steady and undeniable. I whispered to myself, barely breathing, "She isn't just living in my house. She's rewriting who owns it." The sound of the baby crying echoed downstairs, sharp and distant, and I sat there motionless, feeling the weight of it all settle around me like dust. Chapter 3: Strangers in the Driveway. The next few days passed in a strange silence, the kind that presses on your chest until you can barely breathe. I went through the motions, cooking breakfast, watering the plants, pretending everything was normal, but I kept glancing at the front window, half expecting something else to change while I wasn't looking. By mid-June, summer had turned the yard a deep green. One afternoon, while folding laundry near the living room window, I noticed a black SUV parked on the curb. The engine idled for a moment, then shut off. A woman stepped out wearing sunglasses and a navy blazer despite the heat. She held a clipboard and a small camera, the kind appraisers use. She walked slowly around the property line, taking photos of the siding, the mailbox, even the backyard fence. I opened the front door and called out, trying to sound polite. "Can I help you?" She looked up from her clipboard and smiled, all business. "Property evaluation for refinancing, ma'am, requested by the homeowner." I froze. "The homeowner?" "Yes, ma'am. Shouldn't take long." Richard came out from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's going on?" The woman glanced at him. "Reeves Realty Group just doing an external assessment." Richard frowned. "We didn't request that. There must be a mistake." She hesitated, her smile tightening. "I just go by the paperwork I'm given, sir." When she left, I could still hear the clicking of her heels on the driveway. Richard muttered something under his breath and went back to his tools. I stood there longer, staring at the street until the SUV disappeared. That evening, I mentioned it during dinner. Luke looked surprised but unconcerned. "Probably a mix-up," he said. "Maybe the bank sent them by accident." Vanessa set down her fork. "Oh, I might know what that's about," she said casually. "I talked to someone about getting the house refinanced so we could lower the insurance rates. Maybe they sent an appraiser." Richard looked puzzled. "We don't need refinancing. The house is paid off." Vanessa smiled. "Oh, I must have misunderstood. Maybe they were checking the area. Anyway, I'll handle it." I watched her wipe her mouth carefully with her napkin, her eyes calm, steady. I said nothing, but inside I felt the faint crack of something breaking wider. A few days later, I saw another car in the driveway. A silver sedan this time. A tall man in a charcoal suit stepped out holding a folder. I recognized him immediately. Michael Reeves. He had come to dinner months ago, introduced as Vanessa's old colleague from her paralegal days. He had been charming then, the kind of man who shook hands firmly and remembered everyone's name. Now, as I watched from the kitchen window, I saw him speaking in low tones to Vanessa on the porch. They stood close, heads bent together. I couldn't hear the words, but every now and then she nodded sharply as if receiving instructions. When Richard walked into the room, I moved away from the window. "Who's that?" he asked. "Vanessa's friend," I said quickly. "The lawyer." He grunted. Probably something about the insurance again. That night, their voices carried faintly through the vents. They spoke about documents, residency rights, something about a legal claim. I sat on the edge of the bed, straining to listen, my stomach twisting tighter with each phrase. Richard had already fallen asleep beside me, his breathing slow and even. I envied him the way he could close his eyes and not see danger hiding behind every polite smile. The next morning, I couldn't keep it inside any longer. I walked across the street to Grace Holden's house. Grace had lived there since before Luke was born. She was 62, widowed, a retired insurance agent who knew everyone in the neighborhood. She greeted me with a hug and a glass of lemonade, the kind of comfort I hadn't felt in years. "What's wrong, Emma?" she asked, studying my face. I told her everything, or at least as much as I could without crying. The appraisal, the new account, the lawyer's visit. Grace listened quietly, her expression hardening. "Emma," she said finally, "if she's having that house appraised, she might be preparing for a legal transfer. It's not common, but I've seen it before. People set up proof of residency and financial contribution. Over time, it creates a record of ownership." I stared at her. "But that's not possible. The deed is in our names." "For now," she said softly. "You need to keep every document you have. Do not confront her yet." I nodded, gripping the glass so tightly that ice clinked against the rim. Grace reached over and squeezed my hand. "You've always been too kind, Emma. Kindness is a good thing, but don't let it blind you." I walked home under the afternoon sun, the heat pressing down on my shoulders. When I opened the door, the smell of citrus cleaner hit me again. Vanessa was in the living room, rocking the baby, humming a soft tune. She looked up and smiled, the picture of domestic calm. "How was Grace?" she asked. "She's fine," I said. "Good," she replied, turning her attention back to the baby. "She's such a sweet woman. I hope she didn't tell you more of her conspiracy stories." I said nothing. My pulse quickened. How did she know I had been to see Grace? That night I waited until the house was completely still. Richard was asleep and even the baby's cries had faded. I sat at my desk with the small lamp on the only pool of light in the dark room. My fingers trembled as I opened our joint email account. The inbox looked normal at first, full of bank statements and newsletters I never read. Then I clicked on the account settings. The contact information had been changed. The recovery email was no longer mine. It read Vanessa Realtor. The phone number was hers. The mailing address was still the same, our home address, but now it belonged to someone else in digital form. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. Every time I thought I had reached the bottom of her manipulation, there was another layer waiting. In the drawer beside me, my old rosary lay coiled like a piece of memory. I picked it up, the beads cool and smooth in my hand. I ran my fingers over them one by one and whispered into the stillness. Things are slipping away faster than I can grasp. Downstairs, the refrigerator hummed softly and a floorboard creaked as if the house itself was listening. I turned off the lamp, sat in the dark, and waited for the courage to face whatever came next. Chapter 4. The Truth Under Light. The next morning, the house felt colder, though the weather had not changed. I moved through the kitchen in silence, careful not to make noise. Richard was already outside tending to the tomatoes. From the window, I could see him crouched in the garden, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet might no longer belong to him. By noon, I had made my decision. I could not keep waiting for something to fix itself. I called Sarah Coleman, a friend I had not spoken to in years. She had once been in my book club before she moved to Denver to open her own law practice. Her voice on the phone was warm, steady, exactly as I remembered. When I told her what had been happening, she didn't interrupt, only listened. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Emma," she said finally, "I need you to come see me. Bring anything you have." That afternoon, I drove to Denver, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers hurt. Her office was small, but neat, tucked between a bakery and a travel agency. When she saw me, she smiled, but her eyes were serious. We sat across from each other at a wooden desk as I handed her the folder I had kept hidden for weeks. She flipped through the pages, the hum of the city outside muffled by the glass windows. When she finished, she closed the folder and leaned back. "Emma," she said, "she's preparing for a lawful property seizure." My heart thudded. Sarah continued, "If you don't act soon, within 12 months, she could claim residential possession. It's rare, but legal under certain conditions, especially if she can prove contribution and long-term residency." The words sank slowly like stones into water. I asked, "What can I do? You have to gather everything. Photos, emails, any evidence that you and Richard still maintain ownership and control. And don't confront her yet, not until we have a plan." On the drive home, the mountains looked sharper against the sky. I felt both frightened and strangely alive. For the first time in years, I was doing something instead of waiting. That evening, I told Richard I had met with Sarah. He listened half-heartedly, nodding, but not really hearing. I don't think he could process it, not yet. When I mentioned that Vanessa might be trying to claim the house, he frowned and said, "That's crazy. She's our daughter-in-law, Emma. She wouldn't do that." I didn't argue. He needed time. Over the next week, I followed Sarah's instructions. I photographed every bill that still bore our names, every drawer filled with old receipts, every insurance renewal, every tax form. I recorded the dates and wrote short notes in the margins so I would not forget. One morning, while organizing the papers, the doorbell rang. Grace stood outside, holding her phone, her expression tight. "Emma," she said, "you need to come see this." I followed her across the street to her house. She led me to her kitchen table where her laptop sat open. The video from her security camera filled the screen. The timestamp read 10:43 a.m. that very day. On the video, a silver sedan pulled into my driveway. Michael Reeves stepped out wearing the same polished suit I had seen before. Beside him was a woman I didn't recognize, also dressed in business attire. They walked around the property, stopping by the porch, the garage, and the mailbox. After a few minutes, the woman pulled out a clipboard and began writing. The camera zoomed in just enough to show the header on the document. I leaned closer. It read, "Home Assessment Form Reeves Realty Group." Then came the part that made my breath catch. The line labeled homeowner was filled in clearly, Vanessa Hart Parker. I felt my knees weaken. Grace paused the video and looked at me. "That's proof," she said quietly. "They're setting up documentation." I swallowed hard. "Can I have a copy of that?" "Of course," she said, sliding a flash drive into the computer. "I'll give you everything. And Emma, be careful." Back at home, I tried to act normal. Vanessa was in the kitchen feeding Oliver. She greeted me with a sweet smile, asking about Grace, about how she was doing. I answered vaguely, afraid my voice would betray me. That night, after Richard went to bed, I sat at the dining table with my phone. I texted Sarah that I had new evidence and attached the video file Grace had given me. She replied within minutes, her message short and sharp. I'll review this tonight. Do not let her know you have it. I spent the rest of the evening pacing the living room. The floorboards creaked under my feet. Every shadow felt heavier. At some point, I must have fallen asleep in the chair because I woke to the sound of the front door opening. It was early morning. Vanessa came in quietly, keys in hand, wearing workout clothes. She startled when she saw me. You're up early, she said lightly. Couldn't sleep, I answered. She smiled. The gym clears my head, she said, pouring herself water. It's important to keep balance. I just nodded, pretending to read the newspaper. When she went upstairs, I exhaled slowly, my hands shaking slightly. Later that afternoon, Sarah called. Her voice was calm but firm. Emma, that footage is exactly what I needed. We must file now before she establishes 12 months of continuous possession. If we wait, the court might recognize her financial contributions as partial ownership. I stared out the window at the yard where Richard was pruning the roses. The sun glinted off the shears in his hands, flashes of light moving through the branches. My pulse raced. Sarah continued, I'll prepare the paperwork and file for protective ownership status. But I'll need you to sign affidavits confirming you and Richard are the sole owners and that you have not granted her any property rights. I'll do it, I said. After hanging up, I sat at the table for a long moment. Fear was still there, sitting beside me like an unwelcome guest, but something stronger had begun to rise underneath it. Resolve. When Richard came in later, he found me sorting through another box of old documents. He asked what I was doing, and I said simply, protecting what's ours. He didn't understand then, but he would. That night, I wrote in my notebook, the same one where I kept my evidence. The handwriting was uneven, but I didn't care. I wrote, It's time to stop being afraid. It's time to fight back. The wind picked up outside, rustling the trees against the house. I looked around the room, the place that had once been filled with laughter and safety, and I made myself a quiet promise that no one would take it away again. Chapter 5. The War of Law and Mind. The days that followed were heavy with silence, the kind that settles between people who know something has changed but are too afraid to say it. I moved carefully through the house, aware of every sound, every door that closed too softly. Vanessa seemed calmer, but it was the calm of someone waiting for the right moment to strike. Sarah kept me busy with paperwork. I signed affidavits, scanned documents, and forwarded emails. She warned me to stay composed, to act as if nothing was happening. Don't give her reason to suspect, she said over the phone. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. Keeping still was harder than fighting. A week later, the whispers began. Grace came over one morning, uneasy. Emma, have you seen the posts? She asked, holding her phone out to me. On the screen were photos of me standing in the yard taken from across the street. The caption read, Sad to see our elderly neighbor struggling with memory and temper issues. Prayers for her family. My stomach tightened. Where did this come from? Grace sighed. It's circulating in the neighborhood group. Vanessa commented under a few of them, saying you've been under stress. People are talking, Emma. They think you might not be well. I sat down, the chair creaking beneath me. I could almost feel Vanessa's hand in it, her perfect tone of concern that always made a lie sound like compassion. Later that day, I overheard her on the phone in the living room. We're doing everything we can. She forgets things, gets confused, sometimes raises her voice at the baby. Her voice broke slightly like a practiced performance. I stepped back into the hallway before she saw me. Within a few days, the change was visible. Neighbors who used to wave at me looked away. One woman I had known for 20 years crossed the street rather than walk past my yard. Richard didn't notice at first. When I told him, he frowned but shrugged. People gossip, he said. Ignore them. But I couldn't ignore the way it spread. My name, my reputation, my sanity. Sarah called that evening. I told her what was happening. She's setting a narrative, Sarah said. If this goes to court, she'll try to paint you as unfit, unstable. Keep track of everything. Don't engage. I promised I would. Luke came home late that night. He looked tired, eyes ringed with dark circles. He stood by the kitchen counter, shifting from one foot to the other. Mom, what's going on? He asked. Vanessa says you've been acting off. She says you've been paranoid about the bills in the house. I felt the familiar sting of betrayal. You think I'm making this up? He hesitated. I don't know what to think. I just want things to calm down. I looked at him, the same boy who once brought me dandelions from the yard, who used to cry when he scraped his knees. Luke, you need to open your eyes. Something is wrong. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. I'll talk to her. But that conversation never happened. Instead, the next day, Vanessa escalated. I overheard her in the nursery with Luke, her voice sharp, each word cutting. If you side with them, I'll sue for full custody of Oliver. I'll tell the court your parents are abusive. I'll make sure they never see him again. I stood outside the door, holding my breath. The baby made a soft noise in his crib. Luke's voice came out low, pleading. Vanessa, please, don't say that. You think I won't, she snapped. Try me. My hands shook as I pulled my phone from my pocket and pressed record. Sarah's voice echoed in my head. Let the evidence speak. That night, I called Sarah and told her everything. She listened quietly, then said, Good. Keep that recording safe. We'll need it. Don't confront her. Stay quiet. But quiet didn't last long. 2 nights later, I was in the kitchen boiling water for tea. Vanessa walked in barefoot, holding her phone. She smiled at me like nothing had ever happened. Could you hand me a cup? She asked. I turned to reach for one in the cabinet. The next thing I knew, the pot clattered, water splashing across the counter. She screamed, Oh my God, you burned me. I froze. Steam rose between us. She grabbed her arm, wincing dramatically. Richard came running from the living room. What happened? She spilled boiling water on me, Vanessa cried, her voice trembling just enough to sound believable. I shook my head. That's not true. It slipped when she startled me. Richard looked between us, confused. The baby started crying upstairs, his wails cutting through the tension. For a moment, no one moved. Then something in Richard broke. He slammed his hand on the counter, his voice deep and furious. Enough, Vanessa. The sound echoed through the house. Vanessa's mouth fell open. She stepped back, eyes wide. Richard had never raised his voice in all the years I'd known him. He pointed toward the doorway. Get out of the kitchen. She hesitated, then turned and walked out, muttering something under her breath. Richard leaned against the counter, breathing hard. I saw what happened, he said finally. She did that on purpose. I felt tears sting my eyes, not from sadness, but from something else, something fierce. She wanted to make me the villain. He nodded slowly. Not anymore. We stood there for a long time, the water cooling around our feet, the house silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. That night, I sat by the window in our upstairs room, watching the streetlights flicker on, one by one. For the first time in months, the fear that had clung to me began to loosen its grip. The illusion of peace was gone, and in its place came something steadier. Not anger, not even relief, just clarity. Downstairs, I heard the soft creak of a door closing and the muffled sound of Vanessa's footsteps fading into the guest room. Richard exhaled heavily beside me and said, We'll fix this, Emma. I promise. I didn't answer. I simply looked out at the dark yard and thought of Sarah's words, of the papers already in motion, of the small recording hidden in my dresser. For the first time, I didn't feel powerless anymore. Chapter 6. Luke's Awakening. The morning after the kitchen incident was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Vanessa had moved into the guest room, claiming she needed space to heal. Richard stayed outside most of the day, trimming bushes that didn't need trimming, too angry to be near her. I kept to my chores, careful, calm, waiting. Luke came home late that evening, his face drawn, his shoulders tense. He kissed Oliver goodnight, then stood in the doorway between the living room and the hall as if he didn't know where to place himself. I looked up from my book and said softly, How's work? He hesitated before answering. Fine, busy. He paused again. Mom, Vanessa says you and Dad want her to move out. I closed the book. That's not what we said, we just need peace in this house. He rubbed his forehead. You're both being unfair. She's been under a lot of stress. She feels like no one appreciates what she's done for the family. Luke, I said what she's done is not help. She's hurt everyone under this roof. He exhaled hard, the way people do when they know they are losing an argument but won't admit it. I just want my family together, he said, and walked upstairs. For the next few days, we barely saw Vanessa. She stayed in her room, blinds drawn, her voice drifting through the walls as she talked on the phone for hours. I couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm of her frustration. Luke became quieter too, caught between guilt and denial. One night I was in bed when I heard them arguing downstairs. Her voice was sharp, his low and tired. I crept to the top of the stairs, careful not to let them hear me. You're overreacting, Luke said. Mom didn't do anything to you. She tried to turn you against me, Vanessa snapped. You think she's innocent? She's been plotting since the day we moved in. That's not true, he said. There was a pause, and then her voice dropped lower, colder. If you side with them, I'll take Oliver and you'll never see him again. Do you understand me? My hand gripped the railing. I heard Luke's voice break slightly. You wouldn't do that. Her answer came out flat and terrifying. Try me. I backed away before they noticed my heart pounding. I wanted to run downstairs and scream, but I didn't. Instead, I went to my room and wrote everything down, every word I could remember. The next morning, I called Sarah and told her. She told me again to be patient, to let the truth unfold on its own. 2 days later, it happened. Luke came home from work early. The house was unusually quiet. Vanessa's door was open, the sound of typing filling the hall. She didn't notice him standing there at first. He watched her for a moment, saw her close a folder on her laptop when she realized he was there. What are you working on? He asked. She turned, smiling too quickly. Just paying bills. Let me see, he said. Her smile faltered. Luke, don't start. He stepped closer, his voice calm but steady. If you have nothing to hide, show me. When she didn't answer, he reached for the laptop. She held it tighter, but he pulled it free. The room fell silent except for the hum of the machine. He opened the folder she had just minimized. The title read, Property Transfer, Parker Residence. Inside were scanned documents, a power of attorney form with my name forged, fake appraisal letters, and email threads between her and Michael Reeves. One of them read, Once I'm listed as co-owner, we can proceed with the claim. Luke felt his stomach turn. What is this? He asked. Vanessa crossed her arms. It's what should have been done years ago. He stared at her. You forged their names. You were going to take the house. She didn't flinch. Because you're too weak to protect your family. This house should belong to us. We're the ones who've lived here, managed it, paid the bills. That's not true, he said quietly. They paid for everything. She laughed, sharp and humorless. You still think loyalty makes you a man. It makes you pathetic. He didn't reply. He just walked to the door with the laptop in his hand. She called after him, her voice shaking with rage. If you leave, I'll ruin you. You'll regret this. He didn't look back. That night, I heard his car in the driveway. When I opened the door, he stood there under the porch light, holding the laptop. His eyes were red. For a second, he looked like the little boy who used to come home crying after school fights. I stepped aside to let him in. He set the laptop on the table and said, You were right. I didn't ask what he had seen. I already knew. He sat down heavily and rubbed his face. She's been planning this for years. The accounts, the mail, the refinancing, everything. There's even a letter ready for filing ownership transfer. Richard came into the kitchen, still in his slippers, and looked at us both. What's going on? Luke met his eyes. Dad, Vanessa tried to take the house. Richard's hand clenched around the chair back. You have proof. Luke nodded and turned the screen toward us. The emails glowed in the dim light. For a long time, none of us spoke. Finally, I reached out and took Luke's hand. You've seen it now, I said. Truth doesn't need defending. The next morning, I called Sarah. She met us at her office that afternoon. Her face stayed calm as she reviewed the files. When she was done, she looked at us and said, This is enough. I'll submit it to the county court and the police. We'll request an immediate injunction. Within 48 hours, Sarah called again. The injunction was granted, she said. Vanessa is legally barred from altering any property documents until the case is resolved. That evening, Sarah's message arrived by email. I printed the official notice and placed it on the kitchen counter. Vanessa found it the next morning. She stormed into the room, waving the paper. You went to the police, I didn't move. You left us no choice. Her eyes blazed. You think this is over? I'll fight back. I'll sue for defamation, for harassment, for whatever it takes. I stood slowly, looking her straight in the eye. You can take everything, Vanessa. Every dollar, everything in this house. But you can't take your own conscience. That's already gone. For the first time, she had no answer. The paper in her hand trembled slightly before she turned and walked out. The slam of the front door echoed through the hallway like thunder. I sank into the nearest chair, the adrenaline finally fading. Richard came over and placed a hand on my shoulder. Luke stood by the window, silent, watching her car disappear down the street. We didn't celebrate. We just sat there in the quiet, each of us breathing, as if learning how again. Outside, the sky was turning pale, the first hint of dawn spreading across the mountains. It felt like the house itself was exhaling after holding its breath for far too long. Chapter 7. The Court of Justice. The weeks leading up to the court hearing passed in a blur of paperwork and quiet tension. Sarah kept me updated daily, her tone always measured calm like a lighthouse cutting through fog. Richard and Luke helped gather what we needed, but the house was heavy with silence. Even laughter from Oliver felt softer, as if the walls were afraid to echo. When the official notice arrived, my hands trembled as I opened it. The trial was set for mid-November at the El Paso County Courthouse. Sarah said it would be a short proceeding since the evidence was strong, but she warned me that Vanessa would not go quietly. The morning of the hearing was gray, the sky thick with low clouds that seemed to sit right on the mountains. I woke before dawn, put on a navy dress I hadn't worn in years, and twisted my hair into a simple bun. Richard held my hand as we drove, his thumb brushing the back of my fingers in the same way he used to when Luke was little and scared of storms. The courthouse loomed tall and sterile, all glass and concrete. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Reporters stood near the entrance, murmuring as people filed through security. I had not expected attention, but the story had spread. A mother-in-law, a forged deed, a daughter-in-law facing charges. It was the kind of drama people couldn't look away from. Sarah met us in the hallway. Her suit was dark gray, her expression unreadable. "Stay calm," she said softly. "We speak with truth, not anger." Luke arrived minutes later, holding a folder of his own notes. He looked nervous but determined. When he hugged me, I felt the tremor in his arms. "I'm sorry for not seeing it sooner," he whispered. I squeezed his hand. "You see it now. That's enough." The courtroom was smaller than I expected, lit by fluorescent lights that hummed faintly. Vanessa sat at the defendant's table, her posture rigid, her expression carefully composed. Michael Reeves sat beside her, eyes darting between papers. He looked thinner, more tired than I remembered. When our eyes met, he looked away. The judge entered, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority. "Court is now in session," she said, and everything around me seemed to fall still. Sarah began by outlining the case, her voice calm, every word precise. She presented the property documents, the bank statements, the emails that showed the gradual transfer of financial control. When she mentioned the appraisal visit, she played Grace's video on the screen. The sound of footsteps on gravel filled the room, and there on camera stood Michael and the woman from Reeves Realty signing papers under the name Vanessa Hart Parker. The defense objected, but the judge overruled. Then came the forged signatures, the fake power of attorney forms, and finally the recorded threats. Sarah played the audio of Vanessa's voice from the night I stood outside the nursery door. The words filled the courtroom. "If you side with them, I'll take Oliver, and you'll never see him again." Vanessa flinched. Luke stared down at his hands. Richard's jaw clenched beside me. When it was the defense's turn, Vanessa's lawyer argued that it was all a misunderstanding. "My client was managing finances out of necessity," he said. "Her actions were administrative, not malicious. The family lived together. Accounts overlap in households like this all the time." Vanessa nodded along, her voice trembling when she spoke. "I never meant harm. I just wanted to make sure our family had security. Maybe I handled things wrong, but it was never with bad intent." Sarah stood. "Then why forge signatures? Why stage an appraisal listing yourself as homeowner? Why spread lies about the very people who sheltered you?" The defense objected again, but the judge allowed it. The air in the room felt thick, every eye fixed on Vanessa. Then came Michael Reeves. He took the stand looking pale, his suit slightly wrinkled. Under questioning, he tried to deflect, claiming he had only given general legal advice. But Sarah's cross-examination was relentless. She pulled up emails with his digital signature messages where he outlined how Vanessa could claim partial ownership through adverse possession statutes and domestic contribution claims. By the third email, his voice cracked. "Yes," he said quietly. "I advised her. It was wrong." The judge's pen moved slowly as she took notes. The murmur in the room grew louder until she raised a hand for silence. When it was my turn to testify, my knees felt weak. Sarah helped me to the stand, her hand steady on my elbow. The clerk swore me in, and for a moment the courtroom blurred before my eyes. I took a deep breath and looked straight ahead. Sarah asked me only one question. "Mrs. Parker, what do you want from this court today?" I hesitated, feeling the weight of years pressing behind my ribs. "I don't need to win," I said softly. "I just want to live peacefully in my own home again." A stillness followed, the kind that hums through every corner of a room when truth has been spoken. Even the judge seemed to pause, her pen resting midair. After closing arguments, we waited. The judge called for a recess, and we stepped into the hallway. Reporters whispered, cameras clicking softly. Luke stood beside me, his hand warm around mine. Richard looked out a window at the mountains, his reflection small and quiet against the glass. When the judge returned, she read her decision slowly, carefully. Vanessa was found guilty of falsifying legal documents and attempting unlawful property transfer. But rather than serve jail time, she agreed to a plea deal, 2 years of probation, repayment of all legal costs, and temporary loss of child custody. She stood there stiffly as the sentence was read, her jaw tight. When the judge asked if she understood, she nodded once her voice barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor." Michael Reeves received his own reprimand, a suspension from legal practice for unethical conduct. He didn't look at anyone as he gathered his papers. As officers approached to escort Vanessa out, she turned toward me. For the first time, the mask slipped. Her eyes were sharp with hatred and something else. Something almost like regret. She leaned slightly as she passed and whispered, "You won." I met her gaze, my voice low but clear. No, truth did. She blinked, her expression flickering, and then she was gone. When we stepped out into the afternoon light, the clouds had finally begun to break apart. The air smelled of rain and earth. Reporters called out questions, but Sarah shielded me from them, leading me toward the car. Richard and Luke followed close behind. As we drove home, none of us spoke. The mountains rolled by their peaks wrapped in mist. I looked out the window at the familiar landscape, at the streets that had once felt heavy with shame. For the first time, they looked open again, alive. When we reached the house, Richard turned off the engine and sat quietly for a moment. "It's over," he said finally. I nodded, my hand resting on the door handle, the weight in my chest lighter than it had been in years. Inside the house waited silent but safe, as if it too had been waiting for justice to come home. Chapter 8. After the storm. The light returns. A year passed quiet and steady, like the soft unfolding of spring after a long winter. The house no longer felt heavy. The air was lighter, carrying the scent of grass and lemon polish instead of tension. I could hear laughter again, real laughter that bounced off the walls and didn't echo with unease. Luke had rented a small townhouse a few streets over, close enough to visit every weekend. He would show up with Oliver in tow, the little boy already running ahead, his sneakers slapping the pavement. "Grandma," he'd shout, his voice bright as sunlight. Every time I heard it, my heart caught in the same place, the one that still couldn't quite believe how far we'd come. Richard spent most mornings in the garden again. The roses had survived the frost, that winter stubborn and beautiful, much like us. Sometimes I'd watch him from the porch, his hat tilted back, his hands in the dirt. He'd catch me staring and grin, that same easy smile I fell in love with all those years ago. Grace came by often with lemon bars and the latest gossip about the neighborhood. Sarah joined her when she could, always with her briefcase still in hand, though she rarely talked about work anymore. The three of us would sit around the kitchen table, sipping tea, trading stories. Every now and then they'd mention my case, the whispers, the courtroom, the moment of truth. Grace liked to say, "It's proof that justice doesn't need to shout to be heard." Sarah would just nod, smiling into her cup. Sometimes when the house was quiet again, I'd think about Vanessa. She had moved to another state from what Luke told me. Her probation had been reduced for good behavior, and she was attending mandatory counseling. I didn't ask for more details. The anger I once felt had faded into something softer, pity maybe, or simply release. She had made her choices, I had made mine, and both of us were living with the consequences. One Sunday morning after Luke and Oliver had left, I went upstairs to the attic. The light filtered through the small round window, catching the dust in slow golden swirls. In a corner trunk beneath old photo albums, I found the small journal I'd kept during the darkest months. It was bound in worn brown leather, the edges frayed from being opened too often. I carried it downstairs and sat by the window overlooking the yard. The first page was dated 2 summers ago, written in shaky handwriting. "Dear Oliver," it began. "If you ever wonder why people stay silent, it's not always because they're weak. Sometimes silence is the only armor they have left." I read on. The pages were filled with late-night confessions, prayers for strength, and reminders to myself that truth would find its way out. I had written them for him, for the day he might be old enough to understand that family can wound as deeply as it can heal. A light breeze drifted in, carrying the sound of Richard's radio playing an old country song. I smiled and turned another page. The last entry was written the night before the trial. "Tomorrow will decide everything I had written. But even if I lose, I'll know I finally stood up for what was right." I closed the journal, gently pressing my hand over the cover. For a long time, I sat there listening to the quiet hum of life outside the lawnmower from down the street, a dog barking, Oliver's laughter faint in the distance. When the doorbell rang later that afternoon, I wasn't surprised. Grace and Sarah stood there with a new tea blend they wanted me to try. We settled at the kitchen table again, steam rising between us, the same place where so much of this story had begun. Grace laughed about something trivial, Sarah teased her about it, and for a moment I felt suspended in something simple and good. After they left, I stepped outside onto the porch. The evening light stretched long across the yard. Richard was watering the flowers, and Oliver's toy truck sat forgotten near the steps. I could hear Luke's car driving away down the street. Everything looked ordinary, but in the way ordinary things do after you've almost lost them, it glowed. I took a deep breath, the scent of soil and roses mixed with the fading warmth of the sun. My heart felt full, not because everything was perfect, but because it was peaceful. I whispered to myself as much a prayer as a truth. Someday you'll understand, Oliver. Kindness doesn't mean staying silent in the face of injustice. I thought of all the nights I had spent afraid to speak, afraid to break the fragile peace that wasn't peace at all. I thought of the day I walked into that courtroom and spoke just one honest sentence, and how that was enough. My voice softened, steady and sure in the still air. Justice doesn't shout. It arrives with truth, patience, and dignity. The sky above the Rockies glowed a deep gold before turning pale pink. I stood there until the light faded, letting the calm settle around me like a blanket. Then I turned back toward the house, my home ready to close the door on the day and everything that had come before it. If you've ever been underestimated, remember silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the power that comes before justice.